Eleanor Prescott was the embodiment of success. At 42, she was the CEO of Lumina Tech, a groundbreaking tech conglomerate hailed as the industry's vanguard of innovation. Every corner of her life seemed to glisten under the spotlight she had worked tirelessly to cultivate. A pristine marriage to Thomas, her charismatic husband of 15 years, a luxurious penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and a network of influential allies who admired her decisiveness and strategic brilliance. Eleanor prided herself on her ability to read people, believing that nothing could elude her razor-sharp intuition. The evening had begun like so many others in her curated world. Eleanor and Thomas were hosting an anniversary celebration at the Metropolitan Club, a grand affair attended by family, close friends, and the elite of New York's business circle. The room sparkled with elegance, guests in tailored suits and designer gowns, laughter gliding like crystal glasses filled with aged champagne. Eleanor glided through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and basking in the reverence of her peers. Yet beneath the gilded surface of her life, a quiet unease had begun to stir. Subtle things. Thomas had become increasingly distant in recent months, his easy charm now often replaced by an absent-minded preoccupation. Her sister-in-law, Julia, who also happened to be her CFO, had grown uncharacteristically evasive in their meetings. Her once regal hair and bulging blue eyes now averted during financial discussions. And then there were the whispers, unsubstantiated rumors about a project leak at Lumina Tech, a betrayal Eleanor dismissed as impossible. Who would dare cross her? As the evening unfolded, Eleanor noticed Thomas lingering at the bar longer than necessary, engaged in a hushed conversation with Julia. Their postures were conspiratorial, their faces marked by an intensity that set her on edge. She approached with her signature confidence, the heels of her Louboutins clicking against the marble floor. But the conversation dissolved into light-hearted laughter as she reached them. "You're missing the party," Eleanor said smoothly, her eyes flickering between the two. "What's so fascinating over here?" Thomas smiled, his charmingly crooked grin a well-rehearsed shield. "Just reminiscing about old times with Julia. You know how she loves embarrassing me with stories." Julia laughed, the sound a touch too forced. "Just teasing, Eleanor. You know me." Eleanor's instincts prickled, but she forced a gracious smile, cataloging every detail of their body language. She was a master of parsing subtext, and something about their interaction didn't align. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and the guests trickled out, Eleanor found herself unable to shake the nagging sense that the cracks in her perfect life were beginning to widen. Her suspicions deepened when weeks later she noticed a subtle discrepancy during a routine financial review. A significant sum had been funneled into a subsidiary project Eleanor didn't recall approving. Julia's signature was on the authorization. Eleanor called her CFO into her office the next morning, a sleek, glass-walled sanctum that seemed almost too transparent given the secrets it now contained. "Julia, we need to discuss the Horizon project. There's a 6-figure allocation here that doesn't match the original plan. Care to explain?" Julia hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her tailored blazer. "It's just a minor adjustment, Ellie. Nothing to worry about. We had to move fast on an opportunity, and I thought it best not to bother you with the details." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice icy and controlled. "You know how I feel about unauthorized decisions, and since when has not bothering me been part of your job description?" The tension in the room was palpable, but Julia held her ground, deflecting with an air of nonchalance. "If it's a problem, I'll get the team to draw up a revised report." Eleanor nodded, her expression betraying none of the storm brewing inside. She ended the meeting quickly, but as Julia left, Eleanor couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that her CFO and sister-in-law might be hiding something far graver than a budgetary misstep. The final straw came on a quiet Wednesday evening. Thomas, a passionate amateur photographer, had grown increasingly obsessed with his craft, disappearing for hours with his camera and claiming to be capturing landscapes and sunsets. Eleanor rarely questioned his hobbies, but something about his erratic behavior made her stomach churn with unease. That night, curiosity got the better of her. She followed him as he left their penthouse with his camera bag slung over her shoulder, staying several cars behind as he navigated the city streets. He stopped at Central Park, where Eleanor parked discreetly and shadowed him on foot. Her heart pounded as she saw him approach a secluded clearing where Julia was waiting, dressed casually but meticulously. They laughed softly as Thomas adjusted his camera, directing her to pose beneath the golden light of the street lamp. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she watched them through the foliage, her world shattering with each click of the shutter. She had spent her life capturing the essence of people, stripping away their masks with her insight. Yet here she was, blindsided, her once perfect life refracted into cruel shards of betrayal. This wasn't just a family betrayal, it was personal, professional, and calculated. Eleanor vowed, as she stepped back into the shadows, that she would unravel the web they had spun around her, strand by strand. Eleanor sat alone in her penthouse that night, her gaze fixed on the city lights sprawling below her. The world outside shimmered with possibility, but inside she felt trapped in a silent, suffocating storm. Her mind replayed the scene in the park, Thomas adjusting his camera, Julia tilting her head just so, their shared laughter like a taunt. The betrayal wasn't just about their affair, it was the implications that churned her stomach. What else had they conspired to take from her? She poured herself a glass of bourbon, her steady hand betraying none of the turmoil within. Eleanor had spent years mastering control of her company, her image, her emotions. But tonight the cracks were too deep to ignore. She thought of Julia's evasive behavior during financial reviews, Thomas's sudden penchant for photography. The puzzle pieces were there, and Eleanor's analytical mind began to assemble them. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at Lumitech early, her stiletto heels clicking against the marble floor of the nearly empty office. The sleek, glass-walled building, a symbol of her ambition and triumph, now felt tainted. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. In her private office, Eleanor accessed the company's secure server, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She pulled up the financial reports for the Horizon project, cross-referencing them with internal communications. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Emails between Julia and several third-party vendors discussing Exodus payments and untracked allocations. The language was carefully worded, but the intent was clear. Funds were being siphoned off, and Julia was at the center of it. As she delved deeper, Eleanor found something even more alarming. Thomas's name appeared in several email threads, his personal photography business listed as a recipient of payments disguised as consulting fees. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was theft, coordinated, and deliberate. Eleanor didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she played the part of the unassuming spouse and boss, observing their every move. She noticed how Thomas's absences coincided with Julia's business trips. At the office, Julia avoided eye contact, her usually sharp demeanor replaced with an almost nervous energy. It was as if they sensed Eleanor's growing awareness, but they underestimated her patience. Days turned into weeks, as Eleanor meticulously gathered evidence. She hired a private investigator, an old acquaintance from her college days who specialized in corporate espionage. The investigator confirmed her suspicions. Thomas and Julia had been meeting regularly, their locations ranging from discreet cafes to luxury hotels. But the most damning revelation came in the form of a photograph. A grainy image of Julia handing a manila envelope to one of Lumina Tech's competitors. Eleanor's world tilted as the scope of the betrayal became clear. Julia wasn't just embezzling funds, she was leaking proprietary information to their rivals, and Thomas, her trusted partner in life, was complicit in every step. One evening, Eleanor decided to test Thomas's loyalty. Over dinner, she casually mentioned an upcoming project, an entirely fictitious venture she claimed was in the early stages of development. She described it in detail, watching Thomas's reaction closely. His eyes lit up with feigned interest, but Eleanor caught the slight twitch in his jaw, the flicker of something darker. "Melbooth sounds like a game changer," he said, swirling his wine glass. "Who's heading it up?" "Just me for now," Eleanor replied, her tone light. "It's too sensitive to involve anyone else." Thomas nodded, but Eleanor noted the way he shifted in his seat, his usual confidence replaced with unease. By the next morning, Eleanor's investigator confirmed her suspicion. Thomas had shared details of the fake project with Julia, who in turn had contacted the same competitor. It was the final straw. Eleanor began to devise her response with the same precision she used to navigate hostile boardrooms. She couldn't afford to act impulsively. She needed a strategy that would not only expose their treachery, but also ensure they faced the full weight of the consequences. She started by securing her position at Lumina Tech, quietly meeting with key board members and gaining their support. She framed her concerns as proactive measures to safeguard the company against potential threats, never hinting at the betrayal within her own circle. Next, she worked with her legal team to tighten the company's contracts and confidentiality agreements, ensuring that any leaks could be traced back to their source. At the same time, she began documenting every interaction with Julia and Thomas, compiling a dossier of evidence that would be impossible to refute. The opportunity for confrontation came during Lumina Tech's quarterly leadership retreat, a lavish affair held at a secluded resort. Eleanor orchestrated the setting carefully, ensuring both Thomas and Julia would be in attendance. She made her move during a private meeting with Julia, confronting her with the financial discrepancies. Julia's initial reaction was denial, her tone defensive. "You're mistaken, Ellie. Those payments were legitimate. I can explain." "Save it," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold as steel. She slid a folder across the table, its contents damning. "I have everything. Emails, bank statements, even surveillance footage. The only thing I don't have is an explanation that justifies your betrayal." Julia's composure crumbled, her face paling as she realized the extent of Eleanor's knowledge. "It's not what you think," she stammered. "Thomas, he dragged me into this. I didn't have a choice." "Didn't you?" Eleanor's tone was icy, her gaze unrelenting. "You had every opportunity to come to me, to tell me the truth. Instead, you chose to sell out the company I built." Thomas's reckoning came later that evening. Eleanor waited until they were alone in their suite, the tension between them palpable. She confronted him with the same evidence, her words cutting through his protests like a blade. "You've underestimated me, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't put the pieces together, but you forgot who I am. You forgot what I'm capable of." Thomas tried to justify his actions, blaming his involvement on financial pressures and Julia's influence. But Eleanor saw through his excuses. her love for him eroded by the weight of his betrayal. "You had a choice," she said, her voice breaking for the first time, "and you chose to betray me." The climax of Eleanor's plan came at the retreat's closing dinner, attended by the entire leadership team. In a calculated move, she unveiled the evidence of Julia's embezzlement and espionage, framing it as a warning about the importance of loyalty and integrity. She stopped short of naming Thomas, choosing instead to confront him privately afterward. The board was stunned, but their loyalty to Eleanor remained steadfast. Julia was escorted out of the resort by security, her career in shambles. As for Thomas, Eleanor handed him an envelope containing divorce papers and a detailed account of his betrayal. "You're free to go," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But know this, I won't let you walk away unscathed." That night, as Eleanor stood on the balcony of her suite, the cool breeze carrying away the remnants of her heartbreak, she felt a newfound sense of clarity. Her life had been built on the illusion of perfection, but now she was free to rebuild it on her own terms. The days following the retreat were a whirlwind of strategic maneuvers, precise actions, and steely resolve. Eleanor Prescott, no longer blinded by the facade of her perfect life, took charge of her destiny with an iron will. The betrayal had cut deeply, but she was determined not to let the pain consume her. Instead, it became fuel for her calculated retribution. She began her campaign quietly, without alerting her adversaries to her plans. Eleanor understood the value of timing. Every move had to be deliberate, every decision part of a larger strategy. This wasn't about mere revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her company, and her dignity. Julia's downfall at the retreat had been public and humiliating, but Eleanor knew it wasn't enough. The damage Julia had caused to Luminatech extended beyond finances. The leaks to competitors had compromised months of innovation, setting the company back in ways that weren't immediately visible. Eleanor needed to ensure Julia could never recover her position of influence or pose a threat again. Using her legal team, Eleanor launched a full-scale internal audit, citing necessary restructuring as the reason. The audit revealed further discrepancies, including personal expenses Julia had disguised as business costs, luxury vacations, designer purchases, and even payments for private security. Armed with this evidence, Eleanor filed a lawsuit against Julia for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, Eleanor leaked select pieces of information to industry insiders and the media. The headlines the next morning painted Julia as a disgraced CFO who had betrayed her own company for personal gain. By the end of the week, Julia's professional reputation was irreparably damaged. Former colleagues distanced themselves, and potential employers rescinded offers. Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction as she watched Julia's carefully curated world collapse. Dealing with Thomas was a more personal matter. Eleanor had loved him once, and the remnants of that love made her revenge more complicated. But she couldn't let sentimentality cloud her judgment. Thomas's betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. He had conspired against her, jeopardized her company, and exploited her trust. For that, there could be no forgiveness. The divorce proceedings were swift and ruthless. Eleanor's legal team, bolstered by the evidence she had gathered, ensured that Thomas walked away with little more than his personal belongings. His financial dependence on her, once a point of vulnerability for Eleanor, now became her strength. She froze their joint accounts, forcing Thomas to rely on the meager income from his failing photography business. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She hired the private investigator once more, this time to dig into Thomas's business dealings. What they uncovered was damning. Thomas had been involved in shady transactions, using his photography business as a front to launder money. Armed with this information, Eleanor anonymously tipped off the authorities, ensuring that Thomas's legal troubles would extend far beyond their divorce. The final blow came in the form of a public revelation. At a high-profile charity gala, a staple of New York's elite social calendar, Eleanor made her first public appearance since the retreat. She exuded confidence in a striking crimson gown, her presence commanding attention. During her speech, she subtly alluded to the betrayal she had endured, framing it as a testament to her resilience and strength. "Adversity tests us," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But it also reveals the truth about those around us. Betrayal, while painful, has a way of sharpening our focus and reminding us who we truly are." The room erupted in applause, the message resonating with many who had followed the scandal in the media. Eleanor's poised demeanor contrasted sharply with Thomas's absence, his reputation now tarnished by whispers of his involvement in criminal activity. With Julia and Thomas neutralized, Eleanor turned her attention to repairing the damage they had caused to Luminatech. The internal audit revealed vulnerabilities in the company's systems and processes, which Eleanor addressed with swift precision. She reorganized the leadership team, bringing in trusted colleagues and industry experts to fill the gaps left by Julia's departure. Eleanor also implemented stricter security protocols, ensuring that future leaks would be nearly impossible. She worked closely with the legal and R&D teams to protect Luminatech's intellectual property, filing patents for several key projects and initiating lawsuits against the competitors who had benefited from Julia's treachery. But Eleanor didn't stop at damage control. She knew that to truly recover, Luminatech needed a bold move to re-establish its dominance in the industry. Drawing on her strategic brilliance, she spearheaded the development of a groundbreaking new product, a state-of-the-art AI platform that promised to revolutionize how businesses operated. The launch of the platform was a resounding success. Eleanor's carefully crafted marketing campaign emphasized Luminatech's resilience and innovation, transforming the narrative from one of betrayal to one of triumph. Investors flocked back, and the company's stock price soared. By the end of the quarter, Luminatech was not only back on track, but poised for unprecedented growth. Amid the whirlwind of action, Eleanor allowed herself moments of introspection. Late at night, in the quiet solitude of her penthouse, she reflected on the events that had unfolded. The betrayal had shaken her to her core, forcing her to confront vulnerabilities she hadn't realized she had. For years, she had built her life on the illusion of control, believing that her analytical prowess made her invincible. Now she understood the fragility of trust and the importance of vigilance. But Eleanor also discovered a deeper strength within herself. The experience had tested her in ways she never imagined, pushing her to the brink, but also proving her resilience. She had faced the storm head-on and emerged stronger, more focused, and more determined than ever. Just as Eleanor began to feel a sense of closure, a new piece of information emerged, threatening to reopen old wounds. The private investigator, who had remained on retainer, uncovered a connection between Julia and a senior executive at one of Luminatech's competitors. The executive, it seemed, had been orchestrating the leaks from behind the scenes, using Julia and Thomas as pawns in a larger game. The revelation sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She had thought the betrayal was confined to her closest circle, but now it seemed there were more layers to the conspiracy. The thought of another adversary lurking in the shadows reignited the fire in her. Eleanor knew she couldn't rest until she uncovered the full extent of the scheme. As Eleanor stood on the balcony of her penthouse, the city lights stretching out before her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The betrayal had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something invaluable, a clarity of vision and a determination to protect what was hers at all costs. She had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Eleanor was ready. After all, she hadn't become a titan of industry by shying away from challenges. This was just the beginning. The fallout from Eleanor's revelations during the leadership retreat reverberated through every corner of her life. By the time she returned to Manhattan, the controlled chaos of the previous weeks had given way to a void, silent, vast, and unsettling. The professional and personal worlds she had painstakingly built now lay in tatters. Yet Eleanor knew the battle was far from over. The corporate world was a shark tank, and the exposure of internal betrayal at Luminatech had created ripples in the industry. Competitors smelled blood. The press hounded Eleanor, eager to uncover the details of the scandal she had so meticulously kept under wraps. Reporters camped outside her penthouse and office, peppering her with questions whenever she appeared. How deep does the embezzlement run? Is your CFO cooperating with authorities? Do you hold your husband accountable? Eleanor faced them with the practiced grace of a CEO under siege, issuing only carefully crafted statements through her PR team. To the public, she was the impenetrable face of Luminatech, unshaken, resilient. But behind closed doors, she worked tirelessly to ensure her position and company remained unassailable. In the days following the retreat, Eleanor immersed herself in damage control. Julia's termination had been swift, but Eleanor understood that severing her sister-in-law from the company wasn't the end of the problem. Julia's betrayal had left cracks in Luminatech's armor that needed sealing. Eleanor called an emergency meeting with her legal and financial teams, instructing them to audit every department, vendor, and partnership Julia had touched during her tenure. The process was grueling, uncovering a web of mismanaged funds and suspicious deals. Some led to dead ends, but others pointed to third parties that Julia had colluded with. Eleanor ordered immediate litigation, dragging each complicit entity into court. Her determination was relentless, but even as she navigated the legal battlefield, Eleanor couldn't shake the ache in her chest. Thomas's betrayal lingered like a wound that refused to heal. She had filed for divorce immediately after the retreat, and the paperwork was already in motion. Yet, letting go of 15 years of marriage wasn't as simple as signing her name. She thought of the mornings they had spent sipping coffee together, the vacations where they had laughed until their sides ached, the nights when his touch had felt like home. Every memory now felt like a cruel trick. Eleanor hated him for what he had done, but she hated herself even more for still caring. One evening, while reviewing Luminatech's revised financial strategy in her office, Eleanor received a message from her private investigator. It was a brief email with an attachment and a single line. "You'll want to see this." Eleanor opened the file, her pulse quickening. It contained surveillance footage from the competitor Julia had been colluding with. A clandestine meeting in a dimly lit restaurant. Julia wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was none other than Edward Grant, a former Luminatech executive who had resigned 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Edward had left the company shortly after a failed acquisition deal, citing creative differences. At the time, Eleanor had assumed his departure was a simple matter of ambition clashing with her vision. Now she realized he had likely left to orchestrate this scheme from the outside. The video showed Edward and Julia in animated conversation, passing documents back and forth. Eleanor watched, her anger simmering. Edward had always been a charming strategist, the type of man who could sell ice in a snowstorm. She had once respected his cunning. Now she saw it for what it was: ruthlessness, devoid of ethics. Eleanor closed the video and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Edward was the missing link in the chain of betrayal. He had likely fed Julia the strategy for siphoning funds and leaking information. If Eleanor wanted to strike at the heart of the conspiracy, she needed to take him down. The next morning, Eleanor contacted her investigator again, instructing him to dig deeper into Edward's activities. She also reached out to an old ally in the corporate world, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Margaret Kane, the CEO of a rival tech firm and one of Edward's fiercest competitors. Margaret answered Eleanor's call with cautious curiosity. "Eleanor Prescott, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Margaret, I'll cut to the chase," Eleanor said, her tone sharp. "I have reason to believe Edward Grant has been undermining my company. And I suspect he's been targeting yours as well. I need your help to expose him." Margaret's laugh was cold. "You think I'd trust you? The last time we spoke, you outbid me for the Nexus deal and left my company in the dust." "That was business," Eleanor countered. "This is personal. Edward's a snake, and if we don't work together, he'll come for you next. I have proof, documents, footage. All I need is someone with a reach to make it public without it backfiring on me." Margaret was silent for a moment, then said, "Send me what you have. If it checks out, we'll talk." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and Margaret formed an uneasy alliance. Margaret's PR team leaked stories to the press, painting Edward as a corporate saboteur with a history of unethical behavior. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked behind the scenes to tighten Luminatech's defenses, ensuring Edward couldn't exploit any remaining vulnerabilities. The media frenzy shifted focus from Eleanor's leadership to Edward's misconduct, and the scandal surrounding Luminatech began to fade. But Eleanor knew the battle wasn't over. Edward was too cunning to go down without a fight, and Julia's silence was deafening. Eleanor decided to confront her sister-in-law one last time, meeting her in a sterile conference room at Luminatech's legal office. Julia looked worn, her usual poise replaced with a defeated slump. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Julia asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "The truth," Eleanor replied. "Why? Why would you betray me? After everything I've done for you?" Julia hesitated, then said, "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Eleanor snapped. Julia's gaze hardened. "You think you're untouchable, Eleanor. You think your success gives you the right to control everyone around you, but you're not perfect. You've made enemies, and I was tired of being your shadow." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, but refused to let it show. "So, you sold out to Edward? You let him use you to destroy me?" Julia didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Eleanor left the meeting with a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and an odd sense of closure. Julia's betrayal was rooted in resentment, and while it hurt, it was a pain Eleanor could understand. But Edward was a different beast entirely, and Eleanor wasn't done with him yet. As she rode the elevator back to her office, Eleanor resolved to finish what she had started. She would expose Edward, not just to protect Luminatech, but to prove that no one, no matter how cunning, could outmaneuver her. Eleanor Prescott was many things, but defeated wasn't one of them. Eleanor stood in the quiet of her penthouse, the city glowing below her like a constellation of possibilities. The storm that had engulfed her life was finally nearing its conclusion, but the aftermath left her both relieved and hollow. Everything she had worked for, her company, her marriage, her carefully constructed world, had been reshaped by betrayal. Yet as she stared into the night, a steely resolve crystallized within her. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about ensuring that no one would dare cross her again. The morning brought a pivotal moment. Eleanor's legal and corporate teams had successfully compiled a damning dossier on Edward Grant, detailing his years of corporate sabotage and unethical dealings. The evidence was airtight: financial transactions linking him to Julia's embezzlement, leaked documents that outlined his schemes, and testimony from complicit third parties who had flipped under pressure. Eleanor had spent weeks orchestrating this chess game, and now the final move was hers to make. Her chosen battlefield was a high-profile investor summit where the most influential figures in the tech industry would gather. Lumina Tech was slated to present its future vision, but Eleanor had other plans. She arrived at the summit dressed in a sleek, dark suit that mirrored her mood, sharp, commanding, and impenetrable. As she took the stage, the room buzzed with anticipation. The recent scandals surrounding Lumina Tech had made her a polarizing figure, but Eleanor thrived in the spotlight. She began her presentation with calculated precision, outlining the company's upcoming projects and innovations. Her words were confident, her delivery flawless. Then, as the presentation neared its conclusion, Eleanor dropped the bombshell. "Before I close, I must address a matter of integrity," she said, her voice steady but tinged with gravity. In recent months, Lumina Tech has faced challenges not from external competitors, but from within. I've uncovered acts of betrayal and corruption designed to undermine our company and erode the trust we've built with our investors and customers. The room fell silent. Eleanor let the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "Today, I'm taking a stand against those who think they can operate without accountability. Edward Grant, a former Lumina Tech executive, has been at the center of a conspiracy to sabotage not only this company but also others in our industry. The evidence is irrefutable." Gasps rippled through the audience as Eleanor's team distributed packets containing the dossier to key attendees. Screens around the room displayed key excerpts, emails, financial statements, and legal testimonies. It was a public unmasking, a corporate execution performed with surgical precision. Edward, who was seated toward the back of the room, rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted. "You're deflecting from your own failures, Eleanor." Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "The truth doesn't need deflection, Edward. It speaks for itself." Security moved toward him, but Eleanor raised a hand, stopping them. "Let him stay," she said, her voice calm. "Let him hear the consequences of his actions." The fallout from Eleanor's revelation was immediate. Media outlets picked up the story within hours, plastering Edward's name and face across headlines. Lumina Tech stock, which had wavered during the scandal, rebounded sharply as investors applauded Eleanor's decisive leadership. But Eleanor knew that public vindication was only one part of the battle. The other part was deeply personal. Later that evening, she returned to her office where Thomas was waiting. He had requested a meeting, and though Eleanor had no obligation to hear him out, she allowed it, if only to close the chapter on their shared history. Thomas looked disheveled, a shadow of the man he once was. "Eleanor," he began, his voice thick with regret, "I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but I want to make things right." Eleanor regarded him with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You don't get to make things right, Thomas. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." He stepped closer, his tone pleading. "I was lost, Eleanor. You thought I wouldn't find out," she interrupted, her voice cold. "You thought I was too consumed with my work to notice what was happening right under my nose. But you underestimated me, just like Julia and Edward did." Thomas faltered, his words failing him. Eleanor took a deep breath, her next words heavy with finality. "Our marriage is over. You betrayed me, not just as your wife, but as the person who trusted you most. There's no coming back from that." She handed him a folder containing the final divorce settlement, her decision as unwavering as her resolve. Thomas left without another word, and as the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt an unexpected lightness. The burden of his betrayal no longer weighed her down. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to rebuild, not just her company, but herself. She reconnected with old friends she had neglected during her rise to power, finding solace in their unwavering support. She also began mentoring young women in the tech industry, determined to create a legacy that would outlast the scars of betrayal. But Eleanor was no longer the same woman she had been before. The experience had reshaped her, sharpening her instincts and reinforcing her belief in her own resilience. She had faced the abyss and emerged stronger, her resolve unbreakable. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. The skyline glittered with a promise of renewal, and for the first time in months, she felt at peace. Betrayal had threatened to destroy her, but it had also revealed her greatest strength, her ability to adapt, to endure, and to rise above the chaos. Eleanor raised her glass to the city and to herself, a silent toast to the woman who had survived the storm and reclaimed her place in the world. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibilities. And this time, she would face it on her own terms, with her head held high and her heart fortified against whatever lay ahead.